When I was 17, I left home for college. 1 month later, my mother was diagnosed with cancer for the second time. That was a scary time for all of us, but her journey in fighting this battle and the journey we took together as a family forever changed the way I think about resilience. I learned that resilience is not about the actions of a single person. It's the work of a community, a family. It's about the relationships we form with others. And these relationships, I learned, are the key to resilience. I've carried this insight with me throughout my life. I see it in the people that I meet. I see it in the organizations that I work with and study. I see it in my work, in my research, and in my teaching. It's something that's fundamentally changed how I think about how we overcome, how we adapt, and today I want to share it with you. My first perceptions of resilience came from my family's stories. My mother, even before her cancer diagnosis, was no stranger to hardship. She grew up the daughter of an army officer in central China, one of 4 children in conditions that could generously be described as poverty. She was working in a department store when she met my father, who himself grew up during the Cultural Revolution in China and was sent with my grandfather to a collective farm to work in the countryside. None of them had planned for this, but times were changing and they needed to adapt. My parents were in their mid-20s, they married and had me, and 18 months later, our family moved to the United States. My father went first to start a PhD program, and my mother and I followed 6 months later. When my mother stepped on the plane, she carried with her a suitcase, $200 in cash, and me. And what was waiting for her when she landed was a country she had never stepped foot in, a language she didn't understand, and a life she knew she would have to build from scratch. I saw resilience in action before I even had a word for it. Together, we built a life that'll be familiar to many immigrant families, a life characterized by uncertainty and isolation, but also full of hope. And through the eyes of a boy watching his parents struggle for a better future, not just for themselves, but for their children, I saw the power of resilience, the power to turn dreams into reality. When I was young, I never thought about this as resilience. I thought this is just what people did, particularly what immigrant families did. I thought of resilience as something to do with determination, something to do with getting a B on a test and working really hard to get an A on the next one, staying up all night to finish a school project. When I was moving to school, I was young for a college freshman, so people felt like they had to give me a lot of advice so I wouldn't lose my way. And I remember people telling me this would be the time of my life when my resilience would be tested. This would be the time of great intellectual and personal change. And this was the kind of advice that colored my perception of resilience as something to do with hard work and grit, reflected in late nights in the library, skipped meals, and endless coffee. Well, they were right. My resilience would be tested, but it wasn't just mine, it was my family's. A month after I moved to school, my mother, Jeannie, was diagnosed with cancer. The story of resilience I'm going to tell, of true resilience, is hers. Now, even before her diagnosis, my mother had suffered for some time from what we thought were stomach ulcers. And after some back and forth with her medical team, we finally got a second opinion. She was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic stomach cancer. The cancer had spread throughout her abdomen, and the doctors gave her a 5% chance of survival. 5% isn't a very big number. Stomach cancer is hard to beat, especially when it's spread as much as my mom's. And the doctors worked up an aggressive treatment plan: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. My mother, she was a fighter. She suffered the treatment. My father found the finest surgeon on the eastern seaboard. My mother had her stomach, lymph nodes, and many tumors removed at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. She followed that up with weekly chemotherapy treatments there. My college was a 2-hour bus ride from Boston, and I spent every weekend of my first semester there together with my family. After chemo, she started daily radiation treatments, and because these were every day, I couldn't be with her. So my father drove her after work, every day, day after day. She didn't complain. She fought every day. Those of you who have had a family member, a loved one, a friend experience cancer, you will recognize this. And you will also know that treatment continues after getting home from the hospital. In my mother's case, without a stomach, the doctors put her on liquid nutrition and installed a port in her chest to deliver it. Of course, the port became infected and she almost died from sepsis. And still, she did not complain. At that time, we lived in a small farming community in the state of Connecticut. Our town had 3,000 people, 15,000 dairy cows, and no other Chinese families. We had felt isolated when we lived there. No longer. After my mom got home from the hospital, we saw our community come out for us in a way that we never could have imagined. People came from all over to spend time with us, to drop off food, drop off flowers, to share experiences and to tell stories. Our community was our bedrock during this difficult time. I learned 2 things about resilience from these experiences that I've carried with me since then. First, I learned resilience is not about getting knocked down once and then getting back up again. Resilience is about getting knocked down again and again, and getting back up each time stronger and more determined than before. Second, I learned that resilience lies not just in oneself, it lies in the relationships we form with others. It's the work of a community. It's collective strength. I've carried these lessons with me throughout my life, and in some way or another, they shape how I see the world. As a professor of strategy, I have spent years thinking about how organizations can be resilient. And in my work, I've come to notice an interesting pattern over time, that those groups within organizations that are the most resilient are those that come together and focus on what they can achieve collectively. What do we mean when we talk about organizational resilience? Earlier in my career, I was a civilian researcher for the United States Navy. I worked on trying to understand how large institutions adapt or fail to adapt to global challenges. In my work, I was often frustrated by how slowly institutions respond to change. In my work, I got to meet an old Navy captain named Wayne Hughes. Wayne was one of the US Navy's foremost strategists. He saw firsthand the evolution of naval combat in the 20th century, and he was one of the thinkers that led the Navy in adapting to it. When Wayne talked about organizational change, here's what he didn't talk about. He didn't talk about grit. He didn't talk about funding. He didn't talk about technology. He talked about overcoming stagnation, overcoming barriers to change that arise within organizations, and reshaping organizations so that change comes from within. In short, he talked about resilience. Research shows that organizations can lose resilience when they become too rigid, when they're overly focused on rules, when they rely on procedures and old ways of doing things. Now, some procedures are good. We don't want to reinvent the wheel every time we perform a task. But research shows that when we use procedures, we can become stuck in habits, leaders can become risk-averse, and organizations can change too slowly to keep up with the world around them. So how do we break through this stagnation? Just as my mother taught me resilience through the strength of community and family, successful organizations rely on relationships to adapt and to succeed. Relationships between people within organizations are the key to resilience. I saw this firsthand in a set of interviews I conducted with United States Marine Corps officers. This was part of a project in collaboration with my colleague, Professor Mia Augier, where we wanted to understand how Marines solve problems when there isn't a manual. And our Marines told us stories about getting equipment off of a beach cargo ship to Thailand. They told us stories of fending off desert people who'd wandered onto an off-limits training ground in Arizona. They told us stories of dealing with malfunctioning satellite systems in the forests of Romania. Common to all these stories was this: Marines overcome challenges by relying on the relationships they built with one another. Now, why is it that these relationships matter? In my research, I show that as we build relationships at work, as we work with one another, we come to know our collective strengths and weaknesses. We know what we're good at and what we're weaker at. We know our skills and abilities. And in turn, this knowledge allows us to know who to turn to in unfamiliar situations. It allows us to know who to rely on and for what. It gives us greater trust in the new ideas of others, and it helps us coordinate to perform tasks. My co-authors and I have seen this again and again. I've seen it in the emergency room trauma teams that I study, working to treat critically injured patients. I see it in the data that I analyze on Danish startups, where the lasting ties formed between team members have meaningful impacts on venture outcomes. I see it in the student teams that I study in the laboratory. Once you see resilience for what it is, for the importance of these relationships and helping us to adapt, you start to see it everywhere. My mother has been cancer-free for 18 years. She and my father now live in Shanghai, and when we were last visiting them, my mother said this to my wife. She said, "The doctors told me I had a 5% chance of survival. I told them I don't care. I don't care if it's a 1% chance of survival. I am that 1%, and I'm going to survive." Through the power of the relationships around her, she did just that. I want to leave you with one thought today. I want you to stop asking yourself, what can I do to make myself more resilient? Instead, I want you to ask yourself, what can I do to make the person next to me more resilient? What can I do to make my community more resilient? When resilience is grounded in relationships, we are all stronger together. Thank you.